35 sekunder igjen. And then the time is here to change into English, and it's an honor for me to introduce the main speaker of this seminar, consultant clinical psychologist, Dr. Lucy Johnstone. And she has worked as a clinical psychologist for very many years. And she is also now associated with, like Birgit said, she's associated with MAD in UK. And she is author of several books, book chapters and articles, taking a critical perspective on mental health theory and practices. And Lucy Johnstone was, together with Professor Barry Boyle, lead author for the Power, Threat, Meaning framework, a British Psychological Society publication co-produced with service users, which outlines a conceptual alternative to psychiatric diagnosis. And that is what she will talk about today. Lucy, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello everybody, can you see me and hear me? Yes. Great, excellent, very nice to be here. My country is a mess. Don't go to the UK, and in fact I'd quite like to stay here. It's my first visit to Norway, I like it very much. The trains run, the planes arrive on time, the hotel is clean, so very nice to be here. I hope it's my first visit, I hope not my last visit. And I'm very, very pleased to hear about the forthcoming translation of the framework. That's fantastic. And it won't make a lot of sense to me, but I hope it will make sense to all of you. So, lovely to be here and to meet people that I know about and have read about. I know there's some very important innovative practice going on in Norway, and I know there are lots of things that still need to change. So pretty much like UK in that respect, but we're all together, I think, because whatever our particular views and experiences, we think there are some fundamental things still very wrong that need to change. And the framework is about, we hope, trying to take us one step further down that road towards proper change. So what we're going to do today is, okay, I'm not very good with technology, all this kind of thing. Anyway, so I've got three sessions. The first one, this is the longest and hardest one. If you can get through this without falling asleep or deciding you need to go home, then the rest of the day will be easier. I'm going to do a brief overview of the outline of the principles of the Power, Threat, Meaning framework. I always warn people about this, and I need to particularly warn you because English isn't the first language of most of you. There are a lot of words on every slide. You do not need to read all those words. I will tell you the important bits on each slide. You can have the slides afterwards. The video is going to be on MAD in Norway in due course, so if you've missed a part of it or a part of it seemed hard to understand, you can always go back to it. So just go with the flow. I want to give you a general impression of what the framework is about. Okay, the second bit I'm going to talk about what might this look like in practice, and the third bit we're going to try out with a bit of audience participation. What might it look like to put together a Power, Threat, Meaning framework narrative? So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to talk more slowly than I usually do. I tend to talk quite fast. If I'm talking too fast, please wave your hands and I will slow down again. Okay, so, and the other thing I always say is you welcome to take exactly what you want from the day. If you find it very interesting, that's fantastic. If you think that you don't agree with any of it, that's absolutely fine. And anything in between is fine. I'm not here to sell you anything, although you can buy a book from me. But apart from that, I'm not here to sell you anything. I'm not here to sell you ideas. But I am here, I hope, so we can all think together a bit about how we might take things further in the field of what we call mental health. So, what I'm going to do is do a tiny weeny bit of background before I start talking about the framework. I want the general context of diagnosis and medical model understandings of what we call mental health problems, I don't like that word, is interesting. I think the diagnostic perspective is on its way out. Now, I don't think it's going to collapse tomorrow or next week or perhaps not even while I'm still around, but I think it is on its way out. And one of the signs of this, one of the many signs, was when DSM-5 was published in 2013, and these very senior people, in fact, Dr. Alan Francis, one of the people who led on putting together the DSM-4, the previous edition of the diagnostic manual, are saying things like, there's no reason to believe that DSM-5 is safe or scientifically sound. Well, that's a pretty damning statement, and he should know because he put most of DSM-4 together. Obviously didn't do a very good job. DSM is totally wrong, an absolute scientific nightmare, patients deserve better. These are very senior American psychiatrists, and Dr. Alan Francis was quoted as saying, there's no definition of a mental disorder, you just can't define it, it's bullshit. I don't know what the Norwegian word is for bullshit, but you get the meaning. Okay, maybe it's the same. So, you know, we are being sold something that the person, one of the most senior psychiatrists in the world, has described as bullshit. And how many people at the same time as they are told you have bipolar disorder, or personality disorder, or schizophrenia, are also told, by the way, you know this is bullshit, don't you? Well, people are not told this, and people have a right to know. And there are also some very senior people. This is a quote from a report by Denise Purias, who I think has been to Norway, who wrote a report for United Nations. You don't need to read all these words. Essentially saying diagnostic tools have expanded, often without a solid scientific basis. We've been sold a myth that the best solutions for mental health challenges are medications and other biomedical interventions. We need a shift from thinking about the medical model towards social determinants, the social factors in people's lives. And he also said in this very groundbreaking report, mental health policy should address the power imbalance rather than the chemical imbalance. If you had to summarise the power threat meaning framework in one sentence, it would be, it's about changing from the chemical imbalance understanding to the power imbalance understanding. So that's right from the top, from different perspectives, of course, people are saying we need to move on. And this, again, you don't need to read all those words, but this is a statement drawn up by the Division of Clinical Psychology in the UK. That's my professional body. It's a small part of the British Psychological Society. So the British Psychological Society covers all types of psychologists. The Division of Clinical Psychology is for clinical psychologists only. And I was part of this group that very slowly and painfully, after a lot of argument and debate and disagreement, managed to produce this statement, very fortunately, at exactly the same time as DSM-5 came out, saying we need to move on from the current classification system. The diagnostic system has significant limitations. We need to move towards a system not based on a disease model. That's quite a radical statement from an organisation that actually isn't a particularly radical one. And lots of psychologists disagree with that, you know, which is okay. They can disagree if they like, but nevertheless that stands as an official statement of my professional body, which I think is a good thing. And just to put you a little bit in the picture about the UK scene, there are a number of critical voices from the UK. I believe some of them have been over here. They're psychiatrists, they're psychologists, they're people from other professional backgrounds, they're service users or survivors. I don't know quite why the UK seems to have a pool of these people, but it's very nice. It's also quite incestuous. We all know each other, and some of us got together to write the framework, but we think in very, very similar ways, even if we have different professional or personal backgrounds. And in the UK, there is a strong tradition of non-medical understandings, one of which is the practice known as formulation. I don't know if that will be a familiar word to any of you, but essentially a formulation is a personal narrative. So instead of telling someone you have schizophrenia, let's say, a formulation, and all clinical psychologists are trained in formulation right from the first day, and all psychologists use formulation as the core of their practice. It's about sitting down with someone and hearing their story and putting that together with what we know about the evidence, for example, the evidence of the impact of trauma and poverty and abuse and so on, and making a very personal story that applies to that particular individual, which helps us to explain why you are feeling so distressed at this moment and what we might be able to do to help you go forward. And it's not a one-off, you have this disorder thing, it's an evolving story, of course. Everybody's stories evolve. So, just to show you what that might look like, I've invented this example, but this is a possible formulation of someone who could be diagnosed with schizophrenia, but could also, perhaps after a period of weeks or months, sometimes longer, sitting down with a professional, could be a psychologist, doesn't have to be a psychologist, that person and the psychologist might be able to come up with a story something like this. Can you read that from the back? Yeah, shall I leave you to read it rather than read it out? So as I say, this is an invented example and it might look a bit like that. So this is the story of someone who heard hostile voices, who had difficult things happening in their life, something in their current life somehow reminded them of all the previous things that had happened, which is a common situation. And you will notice that the formulation is not just about the struggles, but it's also about the strengths. So it's not about what's wrong with you, it's about what you've had to survive and the strength that you have brought to that process. So I think, Birgit, you got into a lot of trouble by suggesting that you could run a centre not based on diagnostic practice as a psychologist. I don't think you've got into that trouble in the UK, so it's interesting. But well done for doing it, because it's always difficult to do things that other people oppose. So, we have official guidelines, the Division of Clinical Psychology, which I helped to draw up. So I've spent a lot of my career writing about practicing, teaching, training in formulation, and they're free. You put that download at that link, and one of their core principles is a formulation is not based on a psychiatric diagnosis. So the guidelines say a formulation is instead of a diagnosis. But, I mean, a lot of psychologists don't use it like that. A lot of psychologists think a formulation is something you add on the top of a diagnosis. Well, I think that's wrong. So practice varies, but nevertheless, there is an established way of thinking that is not diagnostically based. You'll find that somewhere in all UK services, even if it's not the dominant approach. So the framework is partly about building on these traditions and building on a whole lot of other traditions. Very little in the framework is new. And a lot of it, I'd say about 90% of it isn't new, 95% maybe, but what we've tried to do is to pull together a whole lot of non-diagnostic thinking and practice, a lot of which goes back decades, sometimes longer, into a way that's accessible and helpful. And if you want to read more, these two books, it's a very good series, I think, not just because it's published two of my books. So more about the critiques of diagnosis is the first book, and the second book I have 4 copies for 4 lucky people who rush up very, very quickly in the break. I'll sell you one. Okay, this is probably the easiest way into the Power, Threat, Meaning framework. The translation, I hope will be very important and useful, but the framework is quite long and dense and academic. It's kind of deliberately so because we wanted to make it very difficult to dismiss it. So there's lots of references, lots of evidence, doesn't make for a very easy read. So this is the easy read version. This is very much as near as you'll get to a practical set of ideas about how would this work in practice, how would this work for the person I'm working with or supporting, how might it work for me, because the framework is not meant to be just about professional use, it's about all of us, it can be used in peer group, self-help and so on. Okay, so now we're getting to the framework. Okay, so published by the British Psychological Society, the people in the top group are the author group. Jackie Dillon and Eleanor Longdon, as you may well know, are survivors, and there was the core group, about a third of the core group actually have personal experience of distress. So it took us 5 years. We had no idea what we were getting into. If we'd known that, we'd probably never have started. It's a bit like having children. I often say, couldn't possibly regret it, but my goodness, it's hard work. And it's just as well we don't know that before, else we'd never do it. Okay, so what is the framework about? It's an alternative to the diagnostic model of distress. It's not a replacement for everything people are already doing. So things like open dialogue, for example, go very well with the framework. So it's not saying drop open dialogue and do this. It's the idea is that the framework adds extra evidence, extra support, extra validation for all the good practice that's already out there, including formulation, but as you will see, it's wider than formulation as such. But formulation, depending a bit how it's done, would be an example of a practice that the framework would support. And it suggests new way forward. It's attracted a lot of attention, not all of it positive. I might have time to tell you a bit about all the rude things people have said about me. But nevertheless, attracted very widespread interest, which I think suggests there's widespread recognition that what we're doing isn't really working and we need something fundamentally different. So it's worth saying it's not just about diagnostic models, replacing those. It's about narrow versions of psychological understandings as well, which can be just as pathologizing, can be just as wrong, just as much kind of blaming in a way the individual whose thoughts are wrong and need to be adjusted by CBT, that kind of thing. So, and it's not, as is often said, psychologists attacking psychiatrists. It really isn't. In the UK, many psychiatrists support this, many psychologists don't. It's about ways of thinking across groups, across people's personal experiences. We've all had this diagnostic model deeply embedded in our heads through the use of language partly, and it's about really changing a whole way of thinking which affects all of us in westernised societies. It's really got into our brains in a way that I think that's very unhelpful. So it draws on trauma-informed practice quite a lot. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but the large body of evidence that suggests, not surprisingly, that difficult things that happen in our lives can lead to later experiences of distress, but it goes wider than specific traumas like sexual abuse and domestic violence. It looks at factors like inequality, social exclusion, discrimination, colonisation, and so on. It's also about the kinds of distress that people can suffer when they haven't had obviously traumatic lives. And it's about the structures and the ways of thinking that support our current medical model. Okay, and another very brief way of summarising the framework, along with from the chemical imbalance to the power imbalance, is we are proposing that instead of psychiatric diagnoses, we need narratives. Narratives in their broadest sense, and this is something that we all do as human beings. You know, it's about demedicalising, but it's also about deprofessionalising in a way. We have been taught that only a professional can help us understand our distress. It's not true. We existed for thousands of years as a species without very helpful professions like psychology and psychiatry to tell us how to think. We're all naturally storytellers and meaning makers, and but we often need help, I think, to unpick, to push aside the diagnostic narrative so there's space to think about something different. Instead of asking what's wrong with you, ask what's happened to you. And the framework is about all of us. We don't believe there's a separate group of mentally ill people because we all suffer difficult events at times, we all struggle with distress at times, we all have to find ways of making sense of it. So, thinking about narratives, the framework suggests this very loose structure for narratives. Now, once again, it's important to say this is not a new form of assessment procedure. Okay, the idea is not that you sit down in a room with someone and say, how is power operating in your life, and write it down. This is a set of words or areas to discuss which you can use you can use different language, different words, you can start anywhere if you like, because each question overlaps with the other. But it can provide a very loose structure for putting together a non-medical narrative about distress, and that could work at a one-to-one level, or it could work at a group level, or a family level, or perhaps the level of the whole society, as I'm going to explain. And I'm going to go through these questions fairly briefly, because in the final session we're going to have a closer look at what they might look like in practice. So again, don't worry if you don't have time to read all the questions, but they're about what has happened to you, how did it affect you, what sense did you make of it, and what did you have to do to survive. And in one-to-one clinical or peer work or self-help work, you might want to add or start with what are your strengths, and you might want to pull it together as what is your story. Okay, so another slide. I'm going to talk you through these questions fairly briefly, as I said. Another slide with a lot of words on. Don't read all those words. We'll come back to them. But the very first thing we wanted to do in the framework was to put power up front and foremost. A consideration of power is what is most obviously missing from diagnostic understandings. So if you tell someone they have a mental illness, you are telling them it's something inside them at a person that's gone wrong, aren't you? Perhaps something inside their brain. Same with a lot of psychological understandings. So a lot of psychotherapy understandings too are too narrow, too individualistic. So by putting power back, we get away from that tendency to focus the origin of the difficulty in the person. So there's a number of different forms of power: legal, economic, interpersonal, coercive, and so on, which we'll talk about, as I said. Some of these we're not used to thinking about, so social or cultural capital. So this is something like the qualifications, the knowledge, the confidence, the connections, which make life much easier for some people and much harder for others. So I'm a good example of someone with a lot of social and cultural capital. Had a lucky life in many ways. I'm educated, I come from a comfortable family, I'm white, I'm able-bodied, etc. But many of the people we work with do not have those advantages, and we all have a mixture of advantages and disadvantages. We need to take those aspects of people's lives into account, and we need to take into account the fact that by giving someone a label, we are cutting them off from an awful lot of social and cultural capital. We're making it much harder, for example, for them to get a job. Perhaps more difficult to feel they can meet a partner because they've got this horrible label hanging around their neck, and so on. And we've also talked about ideological power, which I'm going to come back to. Why is power so central in the framework? Power is everywhere in our lives, even when we're not aware of it. All the major causes of so-called mental health problems involve inequalities of power. Now this is, again, established very firmly by research, but we act as though we don't know this, but we do know this. Poverty, large differences in wealth and incomes, child abuse and neglect, gender-based, race-based discrimination and violence, colonisation, war and conflict, all of these things have measurable, very large effects on what we call people's mental health. And they arise from power differences between the rich and the poor, adults and children, men and women, white people and non-white people, states, governments and citizens. How does this power operate? Well, it partly operates through what we've called its ideological processes, which involves a lot of the use of language, which Magnus was talking about, I believe, though I didn't understand it, but I can kind of guess roughly what you were saying. How do we operate, how do we use power, particularly as more powerful people, often through the use of language. And we use our language to describe all sorts of things like the social expectations, what we expect of people. These messages come through the media, they come through our education, they come from our politicians. And these ways of thinking become so deeply embedded that it often seems like this is just the way the world is. You know, so for many years it was believed, shockingly, that women weren't actually able to vote because their brains couldn't understand enough about the state of the world in order to justify having a vote. We just thought that was the way the world was. And we had racist beliefs, and we still have racist beliefs, and so on. Very hard to question because they come part of our way of thinking, and that's partly through the language we use. Okay, so, for example, when we talk about rape, you still hear people say things like, she asked for it. When we talk about poverty in the UK, we hear people say things like they're welfare scroungers. They're just, they could get a job if they want, they're just lazy. and so on. And in mental health systems, we use the language of mental illness, of symptoms, of mental health problems, which I think is just as unhelpful, to be honest, of patients, of treatments. All of these particular uses of language imply a particular model. They imply that we're dealing with medical problems, with medical solutions. And in doing that, we are often enabled to turn social problems into individual ones, and then we label people as bad or mad, or sometimes both. And in the framework, we are very clear that if you impose a diagnosis without offering alternatives, if you say you have bipolar disorder, you have a personality disorder, this is an act of injustice. It's an abuse of power. I've said this to lots of groups, including several groups consisting entirely of psychiatrists. Interestingly, nobody disagreed with me. They just looked a bit surprised. But it's an abuse of power, and it leads to further abuses of power. And insofar as we all go along with that, and I include my own profession, we are colluding with it. Once you've been labelled in that way, it's okay to hold people down and inject them. It's okay to drag them into hospital, and so on. Okay, now, we may discuss this later. We live in a world based on diagnosis, so I always say this as well. Of course, you might need this label for access to services or benefits, or you might choose to use it yourself. That's fine. So we have to be pragmatic. We don't want people to not get access to their benefits because they need a label, but at the very, very least, we should be having an honest discussion with people about what these labels are and giving them their own choice. And a choice has to be based on information, and the information has to include, these are not valid scientific labels. We all know that. So when we focus on power, it's much harder to change what's happened to you back into what's wrong with you, because power links personal and political, links distress to inequalities, links the social, psychological and biological, makes distress understandable, helps to restore agency, in other words, the belief that you can do something about the difficulties in your life. And, of course, power also operates positively and protectively. We're not saying power is bad. Those of us in the room who are professionals have acquired quite a lot of power because we want to help people. You know, parents necessarily have power over their children because they want to bring them up safely and protect them. It's about being aware of the impact of power, and it's about using it constructively. Okay. So, how did it affect you? I'm going to whiz through this. This follows automatically from a consideration of power. If you start thinking about power, it'll immediately be obvious that power has affected your life in all sorts of ways, which will include your relationships, your ability to manage your emotions, your links to the community, your economic resources, the environment you live in, your body, your physical health, and again, your value base and your ability to make meanings out of your own life. Something, again, we don't always consider. Are we encouraging people to make their own understandings, their own meanings? Are we listening to their own values and meanings so that they can come to their own understandings about their lives and about the distress they may be suffering? The next question, what sense did you make of it? If we're therapists, then thinking about meaning is the heart of what we do. That's what therapy is about. But as I've already said, there is a risk that meaning is understood at too individualistic a level, that we talk about our negative cognitive assumptions. Do you get this kind of CBT stuff in Norway? Much too much of it in the UK. Not that it's all bad, but some of it is toxic, to be honest. And it's all supposed to be evidence-based, so we're not allowed to question it. But a lot of it's rubbish, take it from me. Okay, so depends how you do it, of course. There are ways of doing the CBT which are narrow and individualistic, but many of those ways are narrow and individualistic. But actually, our individual meanings don't come from nowhere. They don't spring up in our brains just of their own accord. Meaning is both made and found. We get our meanings from everything we hear around us, everything we observe, everything we learn, everything we experience. So in the framework, meaning is a very core thread, but we need to think more broadly about where those meanings come from. And again, we're back to language and ideological power. We can see how these questions actually overlap. So we have common understandings which we perhaps very often don't question about what it is to be mentally ill, what it is to be successful, what it is to be a failure, what it is to be a good mother. Very hard thing to be. We can only do our best, or a good father. What it is to be a happy family, what it is to be a refugee. We have stereotypes, we have assumptions, often without being aware of it. These assumptions, as I've already said, are very often driven by ideological power. It's very much in the interests of many policymakers and our economic systems, let's say, to assume that if you're a man who loses your job, it's somehow your fault and you're a failure and you ought to be able to support your family. So if you take on that sense of shame and self-blame inside yourself, you're less likely to think about, well, why do I live in a society where people don't have decent jobs and aren't paid enough even when they do have jobs? So these meanings are ideologically driven. They serve very often wider economic and political structures. If we think about ideological meanings, it helps us to explain some of the very extreme distress experienced by people who actually have quite comfortable lives. This is a big thing in the UK at the moment, the rising levels of distress among our young people, many of whom have comfortable families, nothing traumatic has happened to them. They are bombarded with messages about, partly through social media, about success, how you should look, what kind of life you should be leading, all sorts of messages. If we understand the role of language, meaning, and ideological power, we can help to understand why you can have distress even without what we might understand as traumas. What did you have to do to survive? So this roughly covers the area that in psychiatry you might call symptoms. In the framework, these are survival responses or threat responses. All the things that may cause us quite a lot of difficulty, hearing voices or feeling very panicky and anxious or finding it hard to leave the house or struggling to manage our eating, they make sense. They're there for a reason. They were certainly originally there as a way of helping us to survive difficult situations, helping us to feel in control and so on. So these are ways of reacting that we need to understand and actually give people credit for, how lucky you were able to do that. It's one of the things that helped you survive. But, of course, these things can outlive their usefulness. They can hang on long after they're needed. They can become a problem in their own right. So this bit of the framework draws heavily on the evidence about trauma-informed practice, which I won't go into it just now, I haven't got time, but tells us a lot about the way our bodies as well as our minds reacts to difficult events, because the framework is very much about, our bodies as well as our minds. It's not about low serotonin causes your depression, it's not about our bodies in that sense, but it is about the impact on our bodies of all the events of our lives that we go through and the way our bodies have evolved to respond. As human beings, we have evolved to respond to certain threats by feeling very anxious and wanting to run away, let's say, or by freezing in fear, and so on. We also include as threat responses some ways of behaving that are not seen as symptoms because they're socially valued and encouraged, like working much too hard. That's mine. Okay, sitting far too long in front of the computer. It won't get you locked up in hospital, but actually it's not always a healthy way to behave, but we don't see it as a symptom because it's socially encouraged. For some people at some times, nevertheless, we can see it as a threat response. So a core purpose of the framework is to make the link between threats and threat responses, or in other words, the link between personal distress and social injustice. When we give someone a psychiatric diagnosis, what we do is we separate the threat response from the threat. We separate the person's reactions, sometimes called symptoms, from the situations and the experiences which meant that they had to use those ways of surviving. So a core purpose of the framework is to show how we can restore the links between personal distress and social and political contexts, which is kind of common sense. It's one of the things we know and yet we don't know. we know and yet we deny. So we all know, as I said a few minutes ago, that people living in poverty are more likely to feel miserable and desperate. Well, of course, is that a surprise? In medical language, they have depression. It's not surprising, but as soon as we know that, we start talking about an epidemic of mental health problems and we start getting very excited about new pills. We don't start thinking maybe people need enough money to live on, and so on. So we apply diagnoses, we lose the link between threats and threat responses. I'm going to show you some examples of this. So COVID, you remember COVID, it's still with us. Okay, you probably dealt with it better than we did. So we're seeing a lot of headlines like this in the UK. Mental health services must be boosted to deal with a tsunami of cases after lockdown. Lots more psychiatrists, lots more psychologists, lots more nurses, lots more money, lots more research, lots more clinics, lots more pills. Okay, and if you look at the people who are worse affected emotionally by COVID, it turns out to be the people you would expect. They were older people who were isolated. They were people who were trapped at home at risk of domestic abuse. They were people whose jobs were very insecure. They were people who didn't have enough money to live on. They were frontline health workers who were exhausted and burnt out. It's not surprising. And almost all minority ethnic groups in the UK had a higher risk of dying from COVID than the white British majority. So what COVID did was expose massive inequalities in the UK and some very good reasons why people were feeling desperate. And what the response is, more pills, more doctors, more professionals. Now, you know, we are understaffed, we do need more resources, but that is never going to be the answer, is it? It's a way of disconnecting the threat from the threat responses. So I wrote an article about it in a journal which went to every psychiatrist in the UK, and only one responded, and he said I was wrong. But anyway, this is what I said. In ordinary language, people with more to be exhausted, depressed and anxious about are feeling more exhausted, depressed and anxious. Ordinary language, I'm very, very keen, and the framework is very, very keen to get back to ordinary language. We don't need a new fancy kind of language, psychological or psychiatric. The general picture is of a population that is largely resilient. It is not a pandemic of mental health problems we need to fear, but a pandemic of mental health thinking. So there. Okay, here's another example. This came out just this week in the UK. Rates of mental disorders, whatever those are, among 17 to 19-year-olds increased in 2022. 1 in 4 17 to 19-year-olds in England had a probable mental health disorder in 2022. What a load of nonsense. Okay, so these are young people who are suffering. Of course they're young people who are suffering. You look at the research, it shows that the young people with these mental health disorders are more likely to have been bullied, to feel unsafe in school, to lack friends, to be worried about exams. They were more likely to be living in a family that couldn't afford to buy enough food, had fallen behind with the rent and the bills, couldn't afford to keep the house warm. So these young people were not developing a mental health disorder, as well as, unfortunately, living in a family that couldn't pay the bills and being bullied at school. They were experiencing the impact of being bullied and living in a family where there's not enough money to go around. So the condition they're suffering from is 12 years of Tory government, actually. But we're not supposed to say that. We're not supposed to say that. Okay. So I'm going to briefly talk about a couple of other aspects of the framework, which we can explore in a bit more detail in the rest of the day. So general patterns, as I've said before, our personal meanings that we make in our heads don't come from nowhere. They come from all the messages around us. So one of the things we try to do in the framework is to put together what these broader narratives might look like. So we're not just talking about one-to-one narratives, important though those are. We are talking about the general narratives that are around in a given society at a given point in time, which feed into our individual narratives. So if you have a general narrative, let's say that women or people from a certain ethnic background are inferior or less intelligent or whatever it is, this is bound to feed into your personal narrative so that you perhaps feel inferior or less confident or whatever. It's a kind of obvious point in a way, but we wanted to actually make an attempt to draw up roughly what these narratives would look like. And of course they're very different from the patterns that underpin medical diagnosis. The patterns that underpin medical diagnosis are about what goes wrong in our bodies. If we are diagnosed with diabetes, that is on the basis of a well-researched pattern about how the pancreas works and what the role of insulin is and so on. What is the equivalent for narratives? What equivalent patterns can we find? Well, they're going to be a different kind of pattern because they're based on meaning, and because of that they're bound to shift. They're bound to shift across time. They're bound to be different from culture to culture. And they're not about conditions people have. They're broad descriptions of what people do in the face of certain kinds of threat. I hope I'm making some sense to you. Okay, so here's some examples. We are still developing them. We've got quite a few new ones. There are some in the framework itself. Surviving bullying as a child or young person. Now, it's a common experience. Everybody's personal experience of being bullied, let's say, will be different, but it's bound to draw on wider sets of understandings about it must be because I'm bad or useless or I'm not good at my schoolwork and so on. Surviving poverty and so on. Everyone will have an individual experience of that, but they'll be drawing on wider narratives, wider power influences. An example I often give is I've done a lot of work with women who've been raped or sexually abused. Each and every one of them came along to me and said, I feel so ashamed, I feel so guilty, it must have been my fault, I should have done this, I shouldn't have worn that, and so on. And after you've met 20, 30, 40, 100, probably several hundred women all saying the same thing, it's only, it makes sense to say, well, where do those meanings come from? Everybody's saying the same thing, and yet everyone's keeping it to themselves. Where did it come from? It comes from wider messages, doesn't it? About women, about men too, about what's acceptable behaviour, what isn't, and so on. And you could argue that if you trace it back and back and back, there are ideological reasons why it might suit societies for women to blame themselves rather than stand up as a group and say, we are fed up of not being safe on our streets and we want things to change. Now, of course, women are saying that, but they're going against a lot of cultural messages in doing so. So, patterns. This is a tiny extract of one of our recent patterns called Surviving Poverty. So the way we've done it is we've taken power, threat, meaning and threat responses in relation to this broader set of experiences and understandings, and these patterns are based on evidence. So this is about how very typically people living in poverty have little access to housing, transport, heating, food and clothing, holidays and so on. And this exposes them to lots and lots of other abuses of power, let's say reduced ability to protect themselves or one's family, pressure of social expectations. Almost every area of your life is likely to be under threat in some way. Meanings may include feeling shamed because we are often very condemning of people who are poor, feeling controlled, feeling trapped, feeling defeated. We may use a number of threat responses, which are often disapproved of, use of alcohol and drugs, but actually it may be one of the few ways we have of surviving. So we have a lot of very good research from the UK, and I'm sure you do too, about social determinants and mental health. So we know that, poverty is one of the factors, and inequality, that impacts badly on people's mental health. But as soon as we know that, we tend to go into the disconnecting the threat from the threat responses way of thinking. So then we start saying, and that's why we've got so many mental illnesses, and that's why we need more professionals. So I've been talking about public health, and I don't regard today. One of the aims of this kind of pattern is that it might help to include all that very useful research, but in a way that doesn't disconnect the threat and the threat response. This could help to inform public health measures, for example, instead of getting pushed off down a mental health illness line. And the other way these patterns may help is if you're putting together your personal story or you're helping someone else to put together their personal story, it might help to show someone this is such a common set of experiences that there's actually a pattern that describes it. So a lot of people say diagnosis helped them to feel less to blame and they weren't alone, but of course a diagnosis comes with lots of disadvantages. This, we think, is a better way of helping people to see I'm not alone, I'm not to blame. It's not surprising I feel like this. Almost anyone else in the same situation might also feel the same. Okay, you're doing very well. Good. So very briefly I want to talk another aspect of the framework. One of the problems of the diagnostic manuals, the DSM and ICD, is that if you go to non-Western cultures or to non-Western groups within Western societies, you will often find very different ways of us understanding distress. People express distress in very different ways. And there's a real problem in trying to work out which bit of the DSM does this fit under. And there's, the solution to this is to put an appendix called culture-bound syndromes in the back of DSM-4. So this roughly means strange ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving that we don't understand, but we think we'll squash them into our diagnostic manual quite soon. It's essentially what it means. So, looked at from a strictly Western point of view, these ways of thinking, feeling, behaving don't make sense. But if you had a narrative-based understanding, of course you would say, well, ways of expressing and healing distress are bound to look very different across cultures and also looking back historically, because patterns of meanings change, personal meanings change, social meanings change, cultural meanings change. Despite that, there is a large movement to export our failed diagnostic model across the globe to countries and cultures that didn't know they needed it, and in my view don't. It's often exported in very narrow versions. It's often exported with the support of the pharmaceutical country, the drug companies, of course. Psychiatrists like Sue and Fernando argue this is simply another form of colonialism, less obvious but just as damaging as earlier forms. It's a powerful statement. I think it's an accurate one. It's not about literally colonising someone's country with tanks and armies. It is about colonising people's minds and very often softening up a culture so that drug companies and all the rest of it can move in. A psychologist called David Ingleby said, Western psychiatry can certainly provide low and middle income countries with instructive examples. They're mainly examples of what not to do. Okay, so the framework emphasises very strongly that we need to go beyond traditional factors in distress, trauma, abuse, poverty and so on, important though those are, and look much more widely at histories of colonisation, slavery, intergenerational trauma, resulting discrimination, loss of identity, culture, heritage and land. And we also need to be humble enough to take on, to reclaim some of the forms of wisdom that non-Western countries, Westernised countries still have, the understanding that you can't separate the individual from the social group, the understanding you need to integrate mind, body, spirit and natural world, the understanding that many rituals and ways of expressing and healing distress that happen at a group level actually work and work very well, and certainly work much better than a lot of what we as Westerners have to offer. Now, the framework was put together by not an entirely white group, but an entirely Westernised group, so we're not saying we're going to export the framework. What we're saying is that if the framework or something like it was our default model, a narrative-based model, we'd be much less inclined to do the arrogant colonising thing of exporting it elsewhere, along with all the failures and the damage from drugs and all the rest of the things that we know about. So, this is my final slide for this bit of the talk. Returning to the theme of narratives, storytelling and meaning-making are universal human skills. The framework provides evidence for the central role of narrative of all kinds as an alternative to diagnosis. Narratives are a means of witnessing and healing both in and beyond services. Art, music, theatre, etc. are just as valid as written narratives, as are community ceremonies and rituals and so on. The psychiatrist Judith Herman, who writes about trauma-informed practice, has talked about the restorative power of truth-telling, restorative meaning healing. And Jackie Dillon, who's one of the authors of the framework, and Rufus May, they're both survivors, have talked about how recovery is a process of reclaiming our experience in order to take back authorship of our own stories. Thank you for listening. That's the worst bit over.